The American Wild West, often romanticized for its gunslinging outlaws and frontier justice, was a lawless land where survival came at any cost. But behind the tales of legendary sheriffs and fearless cowboys were brutal, shocking punishments used to enforce order. In this video, we're uncovering some of the most disturbing and gruesome punishments that defined the American Wild West. Tar and feathering. In the lawless West, punishments weren't always fatal, but they could still be extremely harsh. Tar and feathering, a method brought over from the colonial days, was one of the most humiliating and painful punishments. Typically reserved for those accused of dishonesty or cheating, whether in business or gambling, this form of punishment involved covering the victim with hot tar and then rolling them in feathers. The process not only caused excruciating burns, but left the individual publicly shamed, often driven out of town afterward. The social stigma attached to being tarred and feathered could ruin a person's reputation for life, and while it wasn't intended to be fatal, the physical pain was immense. The salted whipping post. The use of salt after a whipping was a particularly cruel method of punishment in the Wild West. After an offender was flogged, salt would sometimes be rubbed into the open wounds to increase the pain and prolong the suffering. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about making a lasting impression on the victim and the audience. The agony inflicted by the combination of physical punishment and the burning salt was said to break even the toughest outlaws, serving as a vivid warning to others who might consider crossing the law. Branding and mutilation. In the Wild West, cattle rustling was one of the most despised crimes. In some areas, those caught stealing livestock were branded with a hot iron as a permanent mark of shame. This served as a warning to others and a way to identify repeat offenders. Branding wasn't the only form of mutilation. In more extreme cases, offenders' ears were cut off or their fingers were amputated, particularly for horse thieves. These punishments weren't just designed to mark criminals, they were meant to inflict a lifelong reminder of their crime. The physical pain and the resulting disfigurement made reintegration into society nearly impossible. Public hangings. Public hangings were among the most common methods of execution in the Wild West, reserved for those convicted of murder, cattle rustling, and other serious crimes. Unlike the more structured legal systems in developed cities, justice in the West was often swift and sometimes mob-driven. Once the guilty verdict was handed down, it didn't take long for the gallows to be erected, sometimes right in the middle of town for everyone to see. The public nature of these hangings served a dual purpose: to eliminate the criminal and to send a clear message to others who might consider breaking the law. A notable case was the hanging of Tom "Black Jack" Ketchum in 1901, an infamous outlaw whose botched hanging led to his decapitation, horrifying the witnesses who had gathered to see him swing. Flogging and whipping. Flogging and whipping were common punishments for lesser crimes such as theft or public drunkenness. The offender would be tied to a post or tree, and the number of lashes would be determined by the severity of the crime. Though not as brutal as execution or mutilation, flogging was still excruciatingly painful and left scars that could last a lifetime. It was often carried out publicly to humiliate the offender and deter others. In some cases, the sheriff himself administered the punishment, ensuring that the community witnessed the consequences of breaking the law. Bounty hunters and rewards. Bounty hunters were another unique aspect of frontier justice. Outlaws with rewards on their heads were hunted down, sometimes dead or alive, with bounty hunters often using extreme methods to capture their targets. Though not technically a punishment in itself, the brutal methods of bounty hunters, who were often just as ruthless as the criminals they pursued, became part of the Wild West's bloody reputation. Men like Pat Garrett, who famously tracked and killed Billy the Kid, symbolized the rough and ready approach to justice in a land where courts were often miles away. Lynch mobs and vigilante justice. With law enforcement spread thin across vast, untamed territories, frontier justice was often taken into the hands of vigilantes. Lynch mobs became infamous in the Wild West, where accused criminals, sometimes guilty, sometimes not, were dragged from their homes or jails and strung up on trees or poles without a trial. These acts were brutal and chaotic, often fueled by anger or the need to settle scores. But they were also a reflection of the desperation of a society without consistent legal structure. The infamous case of the 1882 lynching of Ketchum, Idaho's town marshal, underscored how easily accusations could lead to brutal, swift executions without due process. The hanging judge, Judge Isaac Parker. No discussion of Wild West punishments would be complete without mentioning Judge Isaac Parker, also known as the hanging judge. Operating out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, from 1875 to 1896, Parker earned his nickname by sentencing 160 people to death, 79 of whom were hanged. Known for his strict interpretation of the law, Parker's courtroom became notorious as a place where swift and often final justice was meted out. His harsh punishments reflected the belief that only extreme measures could maintain order in such a chaotic and violent environment. The punishments used in the American Wild West were as rough and unforgiving as the landscape itself. In a world where law and order were often scarce, extreme measures were used to keep control. Whether through hanging, flogging, or mutilation, these punishments served as both justice and spectacle, a reminder that in the Wild West, life could be as fleeting as a shot of whiskey. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed learning about these shocking punishments, make sure to like and subscribe for more dives into the dark corners of history. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.